Thanks very much, Howard. I appreciate that. I'm not Carrie Buck. Miss Buck called, unfortunately, yesterday, saying that a much higher authority, notably the Prime Minister, had called a series of cabinet meetings to deal with the fact that the House is rising soon, so could someone fill in? So I'm filling in. What I want to do, as Howard says, there's a Canadian, a European, an American perspective. What I want to do is to offer a few comments on the Canadian perspective. I want to begin, however, with an observation about a driver of some of the concerns behind the changing world order that have been implicit. And it seems to me important that when we think about the changing world order and the implications for any particular country, and in this case Canada, we need to think about the impact of the President of the United States on that changing order. It's important, in my view, very simply because if we keep in mind some of the ways in which Mr. Trump's particular perspective is characterized. I actually rather like the economist's way of conceptualizing. There are two particular covers that always sort of do it for me. The first is its cover immediately after the inauguration in 2017, which it seems to me captures nicely the essential approach of Mr. Trump to American politics, and indeed, as it turns out, to foreign policy. The other is a cover in June of 2018, which takes off, for some of you who know, Miley Cyrus's 2013 hit. Mercifully, it's an excellent reproduction of Miley Cyrus's Wrecking Ball. Mercifully, there are clothes on there. But what's important here is to reflect the degree to which so much of what we've been talking about is in fact a function of the unusual approach that Mr. Trump has brought to the presidency. In the Canadian context, what we see is essentially an effort to deal with this. And it's now 2 years ago, this week, that we see the Canadian government really try and articulate a particular response to this. The first was Chrystia Freeland, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and her articulation to Parliament. Her speech to Parliament on the 6th of June 2017, in my humble estimation, will go down in history. It'll be cited very much the way that Louis Saint Laurent's address of 1947 cited, in large part because what Ms. Freeland did was to articulate a particular paean to the contemporary world order. And never before have I heard a Canadian minister, and certainly not a minister from the Liberal Party of Canada, pay such homage to the United States for its role in leading the world order. But what's important about this speech also is the fact that it very much kind of, in a sense, hearkened to the past, and a desire on the part of the Canadian government to keep that order going. A couple of days later, as you know, what we have is the publication of the Strong, Secure and Engaged, the Canadian defense statement. And these two articulations, one a 40-minute speech, the other 100 pages or so of formal articulated policy, really set the stage for the Canadian government's efforts to deal with the changes, the considerable changes that are taking place. What I wanted to do was to look at the three regions that we've been looking at in this conference, and to assess the implications of the changes we've seen in those regions for Canadian defense policy. As I noted in a comment earlier on the earlier panel, what we've done here in this conference is essentially mirror how the United States has organized the world by commands. And indeed, what I want to talk about essentially is the North Atlantic, the Indo-Pacific, and what we might think of as sort of the Americas. Let me begin with the North Atlantic, because it is here that we continue to see the dominance of, for Canada, looking east across the Atlantic, the conceptualization of the Atlantic region as core and as crucial and critical for Canadian policy. But what we see, it seems to me, is a fracturing. It's not yet come full circle, but we see a fracturing of the alliance. NATO, as a recent commentary had it, NATO is doing well in the sense that, for those of us with long memories, we know that the alliance has been under stress. But rarely have we seen, it seems to me, a willingness on the part, in particular, of the leader of the alliance to raise essential questions about the alliance. And it seems to me that as Dan Dresner put it yesterday, you can push against the robust pillars of the alliance, but how long can you do it for? And so it seems to me that what we need to do when we think about the implications for Canada, one of the things that our planning that took place in 2017 really hasn't done is think about the implications, and Anna Geis will talk more about what's going on the other side of the Atlantic, but we haven't really thought about what the implications of a NATO truly under stress is going to be. The security environment in the Indo-Pacific is, Canada has traditionally looked east. The North Atlantic has always anchored us. And for a variety of reasons, while we have been in the Indo-Pacific, as General Eyre quite correctly noted, we're not there in full force. We're noted much more for our commitment to NATO and to the North Atlantic than we are to the Indo-Pacific. The reasons for this are well known to everyone in the room. It's expensive to project yourself across two oceans. And Canadians, generally speaking, are inordinately stingy when it comes to spending on international affairs, in particular in times of systemic peace. And so what we see is in a sense, a very limited Canadian projection across the Pacific, And even when we do project, it's interesting to think about, for example, what the mindset of our minister, who when he attends Asia-Pacific events, tends to bring, if you think about the kinds of conversations that he has with his counterparts across the Pacific, tends to bring very much a kind of a traditional Canadian perspective with him, one that doesn't really begin to address some of the serious changes that are underway. Because it's not clear to me that the Canadian government has really given much thought to the issue of decoupling. I asked Professor Dresner yesterday about decoupling and what I see as the progressive decoupling, and he, I think, offered a really good answer that basically said, take a breath, but recognize the willingness on the part of both folks in Washington and in Beijing to go through that decoupling process. And it seems to me that one of the things that we need to think about is where we can see this decoupling most clearly in evidence. Ali Wine talked earlier today about the unwillingness to think about what we're seeing in Sino-American relations as a new Cold War, and I couldn't agree more. But in the case of technology, it seems to me that what we are in fact seeing is the development of a new Cold War where we see the separation on both sides. Now, to be sure, as Ali suggests, there's pushback. But in the case of Canada, the willingness to make that decision as to whether or not to choose the United States or China is very much more problematic than it is, for example, for the Europeans. One of the things that we need to think about, it seems to me, as Canadians, are what the implications, the future implications are for the possibility of a deepening of the decoupling. And it occurred to me as I was preparing these remarks earlier today, that one of the things that we haven't heard from our government about is what's happening in Hong Kong right now. And the possibility that what we might be seeing is particular flashpoints that will accelerate and deepen the willingness on the part of the United States and China to seriously rejig their relationship. Not perhaps to Cold War levels, absolutely, but nonetheless a concern. Yesterday we talked about the Americas, and much of the focus was on what was happening to the south of the United States, and that is a good way of reflecting on where the attention of Washington and American politics is very much focused. What I want to do is to close off by reflecting on the security environment in the Americas from the perspective of what's happening to the north of the Rio Grande. First of all, the Arctic. And it seems to me here we've got a real paradox. Much of this conference has been focused on the international order, the American-led international order, and implicitly some of the concerns that derive from an American or the United States stepping away from some of the elements of the world order, not simply Mr. Trump, but going back to the Bush and Obama administrations. But in the case of the Arctic, what we see, it seems to me what we're seeing is the possibility of a Canada-driven shift in the order. In particular, the challenges to Canada's historically imaginative approach to defining Arctic waters. And that imagination goes all the way back to the famous sector theory of 1909. It is reflected in our highly imaginative approach to our maritime border in the Beaufort Sea, and it is very much reflected in the way in which we regard the Arctic waters and the Northwest Passage. And it seems to me that this particular approach has a fundamental impact on security in the Arctic, as indeed we see the increasing tendency to be able to navigate in that particular area. We also need to reflect on something that hasn't been talked about today, And that is what I would regard, and this is also Canada-driven, what I think of as the evanescence of the culture of partnership in the North American defense relationship. What we've seen, it seems to me, in Canada over the last 20 years is an approach to the security environment in North America that is radically different to the Canadian approach to the security environment that we saw in the 1950s and 1960s. What we see quite clearly, it seems to me, is an unwillingness on the part of Canadians today and their governments to reflect on a joint and partnered approach to the defense of the continent as a whole. I'm not suggesting here that NORAD, and in both its air and maritime components, is in a sense under serious threat. But for me, as a political scientist, I just sort of look at the unwillingness of governments in Canada, both conservative and liberal, to as readily embrace notions of how to protect the continent as a whole in the unwillingness, the patent unwillingness of a series of prime ministers and their governments to, for example, participate in ballistic missile defense. The unwillingness to basically think about the air defense of North America and to not do what governments during the Cold War did, which was essentially to look at what the United States was doing in its sectors of NORAD and basically embracing the idea that that was what Canada needed to do as well. The way in which the long-running saga of the replacement for the CF-18 Hornet will play out, it seems to me, be a nice reflection of just how evanescent this particular culture of partnership is. And this, it seems to me, has a profound impact on the order in North America, but in this case, it's Canada and not the United States. Let me just wrap up by noting here that when I look at how the Canadian government has responded to the unprecedented nature of the administration in Washington, it seems to me that what we need to do is to recognize the degree to which the Canadian government has taken a fundamentally what I think of as an a-strategic approach. Instead of looking out at the world and seeing the radical, in my humble estimation, the fairly radical transformations, we haven't sat down and thought about what changes are underway in a strategic way. And all one has to do is to look, with all due respect, at Strong, Secure, and Engaged. That white paper looks exactly like the white papers that were produced in 2008 and 2005 and 1995 and 1987 and 1971 and 1964. Even the tripartite way of conceptualizing where we are, defense of Canada, defense of North America, engagement abroad, there's something that's fundamentally similar. And it seems to me that what we need to do, because we're no longer in that world, is to go beyond and think about the strategic implications.